Hello everyone, welcome back to the class examination of the Paladin. This is the unusual builds that I have built with the Paladin, out of the what I would call the standard builds that you would normally expect to find when building Paladin. Now this is going to get a little bit wild and woolly because there are a couple of variations that I've pulled off with both of these. And actually the first one is going to be the bleeding focused one, which focuses around the Gore Drinker set. Now, this is a set that I very specifically recommend you play with other people, because it really does do a lot more with allies than it does by yourself. So do keep that in mind, that this is a bit less effective in solo play. But if you're playing with a group and you want to be a paladin that really helps out your allies, this is actually the most helpful of the ones that I've found. Now, obviously, the point of this is Pierce Bleed, and you can see here this actual helmet. The reason why I rest on this is because this really nicely sums up the point. You've got Virus Might, you've got Word of Pain. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to very specifically point out. First off, where is it? Ah, yes, down here. The bleeding resistance reduction by Word of Pain. That's actually one of the most significant things here. And stack on the Pierce, Aether, and Chaos resistance reductions that Death Sentence is busting out as well, and just a single cast of Word of Pain, once you've maxed it out all the way here, reduces Pierce, Aether, Chaos, and bleeding damage. It basically does not matter what your allies are. Death Sentence will find some way of reducing one of the enemy's resistances that your allies do, which is also, obviously really potent. Now, another thing that really helps out allies is you'll notice that we're not even anywhere over here. We are specifically going with Aura of Conviction, and the specific reason why is for that Pierce damage. Now, again, this particular build is looking at Pierce and Bleed, so it makes sense to do Aura of Conviction, but since we're already helping allies, any allies nearby also gets this, because this is a 12-meter radius around you that boosts all of your allies' physical, pierce, and internal trauma damage, as well as their offensive ability and physical resistance, right? So this actually really helps your allies out a lot. This is actually the reason why I generally will wear the Mythical Rune Award leg guards with this particular set. Now, the rest of this all really doesn't make a huge difference. These all tend to be whatever I can find that I can equip that increases either the correct skills or the correct stats, one or the other. Again, what these empty spaces are filled with by you is totally up to you, but for the actual set itself, I will obviously have this set, and you obviously are going into Tectonic Shift. Now, how you want to pull it from here really depends, because I have as an example here Bloodborer. Right, this does pierce and bleeding damage. The pair of pistols is really strong. It increases Virus Might. It makes Storm Spread a bleeding type skill. Very potent. And of course, as I've discussed numerous times, Storm Spread is more effective in melee than it is anywhere else. So Virus Might in conjunction with Storm Spread is actually very, very potent. You basically are, busting out Word of Pain as your opening move, Virus Might right on in, and start blasting fools with Storm Spread. Now, I've got Presence of Virtue here. I'm actually going to pull this out because you don't technically need this necessarily. That really depends on how much energy you use. Again, I usually have Word of Renewal because it's just so helpful, it's so useful. But you can, Gore Drinker's Award, you have to have this. It doesn't do anything for this specific combination. That's for soldiers specifically, but that's whatever. But Bloodborer really helps out a lot with this particular item. But I do want to point out that there is a two-handed variant or a two-handed weapon you can use instead, which is the Messenger's Repeater. Now you'll notice that this does Pierce Bleed as well. This converts elemental damage, which is a little less important here. It converts Death Sentence's damage a little bit more, which is nice, than comparatively the Bloodborer, which does not convert elemental damage at all. And while there is some very specific damage types being converted, for example, right here, fire damage is converted to piercing. Fire damage converted to piercing there as well. I'm trying to remember. Just all fire damage. Okay, I thought it was elemental damage, but I was misremembering. It's all fire damage. So this actually converts elemental damage in general to piercing damage, which helps your Word of Pain / Death Sentence to actually be a little bit more effective in that role. 100% of elemental damage, is being converted to piercing damage here, whereas over here, that's not actually happening. While Word of Pain is doing extra bleeding damage, there's no specific conversion necessarily. I mean, yes, Virus Might is getting converted, you can see with the helmet there, but the actual Word of Pain isn't being converted. So really you have a toss-up between whether you use the Messenger's Repeater, which will make Word of Pain more in line with what you're looking for. Again, it's reducing pierce resistance even more, it's reducing even more bleeding resistance, or you can go with the Blood Borers, which focus they basically give you Storm Spread as a viable option. Now, something that I didn't actually specifically fill in, because it is, again, an option, is going into Righteous Fervor. Now, keep in mind that the set itself, I thought the set itself converted elemental damage, but I would have recommended this either way. Going into Righteous Fervor, at the very least the first stage, you don't necessarily have to go into the rest of it. I tend to, because Aura of Conviction is increasing physical and internal trauma damage, so going into Righteous Fervor is generally a good idea anyways, if you don't want to go into Presence of Virtue. It totally depends. But Righteous Fervor is very effective here, especially with the dual-wielding pistols. It remains as effective with the two-handed gun, don't get me wrong, with the Messenger's Repeater, it remains as effective there. But it's just really a matter of your personal preference there. Now, if you don't want to go into Righteous Fervor, or you don't want to necessarily cap Righteous Fervor, maybe you don't want Retribution, perhaps, I would suggest Bursting Round again, that fire damage is being converted over, so that's really nice. Or you could go into Chilling Rounds, which has pierce damage just automatically inherently in here. Of course, the Storm Spread itself is doing piercing damage for the most part, as well as some bleeding damage there. But this is one of the more interesting builds that I've run. Like I said, I prefer it with Righteous Fervor, but that's totally up to you. I just find it incredibly interesting. It is fairly effective, but it's a little bit difficult to put together because, I mean, the Blood Borers, once you get the blueprint, obviously, that's just, you craft these and off you go. But if you choose to use the two-handed gun, you actually have to kill Akaloth the Messenger, and the problem with the Messenger's Repeater, and the reason why I recommend the Blood Borers instead, is two reasons. First off, the Blood Borers, like I said, you can just craft these. Yes, they're expensive to craft. I can't remember the ingredients off the top of my head, but they're pretty expensive to craft comparatively speaking. But it's, you know, you have your ingredients right there. The ingredients are easier to farm than a Messenger's Repeater that boosts Oathkeeper. See, if you want a really good Messenger's Repeater, you're going to have to farm this until you get one that is good for your specific combination. Usually this is going to mean it enhances something along the lines of the Oathkeeper. Having one drop that, for instance, boosts Righteous Fervor would be incredibly potent, right? For the very understandable reason that now Righteous Fervor is doing even more damage. The Messenger's Repeater does have one advantage that the dual-wielding pistols don't, the two Blood Borers. It makes Virus Might hit harder, right? But in exchange, you're shooting Righteous Fervor more slowly, but then you're also doing more damage per shot with Righteous Fervor, rather than having the two shots go off with the Blood Borer. But then you don't necessarily need Storm Spread, and then that's a whole... It really depends on how you want to work this, but I just want you to be aware of the fact that while the Blood Borer is easier to get, the Repeater probably does a little bit more for you if you're more fond of Virus Might. It really depends on how you choose to play the build, but both of these weapon options are absolutely fantastic. Don't get me wrong. Now, when we're talking about... Oops, I keep clicking that. Devotion. This is actually a fairly interesting one in that we pretty much are going right for the Unknown Soldier. This is bleed, pierce, and physical damage. I think actually it's pierce and bleed primarily. Yeah. Rather than as Raka, which is physical pierce. So the Unknown Soldier is generally where you want to go. You just go right into the Assassin's Blade for that pierce resistance down. The physical damage down is nice. You can go into this. The Hydra, obviously, you're using ranged weapons either way. Just the ranged weapons are more effective. And you really want to make a beeline also for the Huntress because of Rend, which reduces enemy bleeding resistance, obviously. Now, I, again, usually use Word of Renewal, so when I build this, I'm running the Lizard, I'm running the Lotus. If you don't run Word of Renewal, you would be thinking about maybe the Eel, which is 3 points for 5 blue, and maybe you're getting, I don't know, you need the green for the Huntress primarily, but you don't need that much green, so you could actually drop the Lotus entirely, go for maybe the Stag, maybe you go for the Panther. I mean, it really depends on what you want to go with. I just use these because I tend to use Word of Renewal, and I like that healing. Now, I've only really gone into the Mantis over here to get the red required for the Huntress. And the Mantis obviously increases pierce damage. And then, of course, we have the Hydra, which is just good for everything that's ranged, which is the rest of the red that we needed, so there's the Huntress. Now, I've also spent points into the Fox for the bleeding increases that it offers here, particularly bleeding duration, right here. I'm sorry, that's not bleeding duration, that's bleeding damage, pardon me, but it's still a really nice increase to bleed, so there is that as well. Again, the Falcon, physical and bleeding damage. We are getting physical damage boosts from the Aura of Convictions. That works really nicely there. That's generally where I go. The Owl, I just generally use as a filler for purple. Again, it boosts everything. Here's bleeding damage increased, which is lovely. So that's generally how I approach a bleeding Paladin, a bleed-focused Paladin. It's a very interesting build. There are obviously other things you can equip depending on what you find. You might luck out, get some really nice green items, whatever you choose. But that's generally how I'll approach this, a bleed-focused Paladin. Now next I want to talk about an Aether-focused Paladin, and there's going to be some overlap with some previous ones. This one's a little less interesting because it is Aether Elemental, because just by nature of Oathkeeper. Now, you'll notice that I'm using the Bonemonger's chest guard because it does boost Aether damage, and more importantly, it provides Aether damage to Smite, which is why we're pretty much required to use a shield for this build, and it gives Aether resistance decreases to Inquisitor Seal, right? So, also, by the way, the Inquisitor Seal does Aether damage, which is really nice to see, but beyond that, the Guardians of Empyrean reduce Aether resistance as well, which is really nice. But otherwise, you're really not seeing a whole bunch of change here. Of course, Smite does Aether damage. I believe it actually lists how much here. Yeah. Which is a really great time. Now again, obviously we're getting some changes here. The Aether resistance down, go into this for the physical elemental resistance down, the bleeding resistance down. Now, beyond the Inquisitor Seal and Smite, right, I tend to run the Flesh Warp Defender for Judgment. Now, the reason why is because, first off, I also usually run Ascendant Authority with this. There are two reasons for this. You can probably see why right off the top. First off, Aether damage, right? Second off, it boosts the speed of Guardians of Empyrean, which is really nice. Now, there are a couple of things that also increases here. It increases Celestial Presence, which you really like. What was the other one it increased? Brain Cramp? Haven, yes. So, I don't usually use Haven here, right? Yes, you absolutely can. If you really want to be supremely tanky, you can absolutely go into Haven. Haven, that's fantastic, but you may not necessarily want to. It really depends on where you want to go with this. And I usually go into Judgment. Besides having the Flesh Warp Defender as my usual shield for this, Judgment is actually really effective with this build because you're standing in your little Inquisitor Seal and you want enemies to come to you, pull them in with Judgment. Boom. Not even a problem. It's fantastic. You're already enhancing fire damage anyways, so the fact that this does fire damage almost exclusively thanks to the shield also really helps. Beyond that, again, this comes down to using whatever other equipment you find that you feel like using and whatever skills. Again, I use Word of Renewal here, but where you want to go from here really depends on you. Maybe you want to go into Divine Mandate. I usually don't. I usually will go up to Aura of Censure. Usually, but not always. It really, again, it depends on what other items I equip that enhance whatever other skills. It really depends. I usually fill out with green items, so it depends on what those green items enhance. But maybe you don't want to go into Aura of Censure. Maybe you want to go into Divine Mandate. That would be fine. Maybe you want Righteous Fervor. Maybe you really want to double down with Haven On the defense, maybe you want to use Safeguard for more physical damage and some extra armor. Maybe you want to splash in Shattering Smash for some more physical. It's totally up to you. I usually will put whatever remaining points I have into Safeguard. You know, whatever leftover points will usually go into Safeguard here. Whether or not I go into Haven depends on how tanky I feel like I need to be. That's a whole different question. Sometimes I don't even necessarily use Judgment. I usually do. Again, it's very helpful with Inquisitor Seal, but I don't always. But again, how you want to necessarily approach this is totally up to you, because beyond having Smite, the Guardians of Empyrean, and the Inquisitor Seal, how you approach this is pretty freeform with what you want to do. Now, when I usually run this build, I'll usually go for a Toxaru and Ultos. Now, Ultos reduces those elemental resistances, which obviously this build does want as well, and a Toxaru does elemental and aether damage, which is the focus of this build. I will also go for the Widow, more for the aether resistance. The lightning resistance is a freebie. I'm getting most of my elemental resistance out of Ultos and the Danger Noodle here, so it's not really hugely important. Obviously, you're using the Quill and the Scholar's Light for the green and purple for Toxaru and Ultos. Well, the purple from Quill, the green from Scholar's Light. The Owl, of course, as always. The Harpy, primarily because just the cold damage, it's 5 points. This is more of a filler. You're doing elemental damage, so it's not like you aren't going to use that cold. So that's kind of where I go with that. The Mantis is kind of the same thing. It's a little bit of red, it's some purple. The Jackal is also fill points. The Spider is actually useful, but it's kind of fill as well. I usually will go into the Imp because Aether damage, obviously, and Fire damage, which, again, we're increasing pretty decently with the Ascendant Authority and the Flesh Warp Defender. But, with that being said, that's generally how I will approach at least a bit of an interesting Aether Elemental build. Again, not too out there, and if you're going from a more standard Paladin that focuses in some way on fire damage, this might be a really nice transition into something a little bit wilder, especially since, again, with these two here, specifically the weapon, the Scepter and the Defender, you can go with a lot of other different things. I'm not covering all the monster and frequents that could work here, because that would take a decent bit of time, and I don't want this particular episode to get too long, because there's 5 builds here, but there's a lot of room to experiment with this build. This is just how I personally prefer to play it, so just keep that in mind, and have fun exploring the ultimate potential of this. Moving on, I want to talk about the Poison Paladin. Now, obviously, we're using the famous Perdition set, gloriously. Notice that fire damage is being converted. Fire damage out the... I'm sorry, why am I looking at these pen spreads at the moment? Fire damage, physical damage, pardon me. And, yeah, you're getting a lot of conversion over here in Path of the 3, of course. So I want to point out here, even assuming the lowest amount of fire damage conversion from this 20% and this 20%, which is 40, and you go over to the Oathkeeper, this converts fire damage by 48. Well, this is, you know, increased by that, by the bonuses. But let's go to the 40% here. You're looking at 80% conversion minimum. This is basically is 90%. So you're getting a lot of conversion over, which is fairly interesting, because you'll notice I've got some things over here that you don't necessarily need. But let's talk about this for a minute. So obviously these are increasing the... I keep looking at the pants because they look so similar. We're increasing Aegis of Men here. We're increasing Path of the 3 here as well, Reprisal. Now, physical damage, which is being converted by this set to some extent. This converts the fire damage over. You technically don't need this, right? You really don't, because 90% of your fire damage is already being converted anyways. Well, between 80 and 90. And then you've got Reprisal, of course, which is pretty important. Which is lovely and all. I usually pair it with the Ugdenbog Venom Launcher, and there are a couple of reasons for this. Again, this is something you'll want to farm for a bit better of a version. I usually will farm for one of these until I get one that boosts Righteous Fervor. I'm kind of obsessive. Obviously, this is doing poison acid damage, which is what you want. And I'll usually bust out Righteous Fervor. Again, this is converting fire damage to vitality damage. It's actually probably better. I actually left this point in here so I would remember to talk about it, but it's actually probably better to not run Dreeg's Reproach, because you are converting 50% of that fire damage, acid damage. If you use Dreeg's Reproach, there's a chance, because I'm not sure which one of these two take priority, but damage can only be converted once, right? So if this fire damage is being converted to vitality damage here, then you're not getting all that bonus from the set. If it's being converted here first, then there's no real point to necessarily Dreeg's Reproach. So generally speaking, I don't build Dreeg's Reproach because I don't quite know what the order of priority here. I think Dreeg's Reproach is the priority here because it directly shoots off of the skill itself. But don't build this, alright? You could get away with building Aegis of Thorns. It's not going to hurt you too much. It's converting the last 10 to 20% fire damage to acid damage, if you even need that much. Again, keep in mind that I assumed the lowest here. You could actually have up to 30% conversion here, which would actually be 100% conversion with even a level 12 Path of the 3, right? So you probably don't need this. You definitely don't need this, but I left it open so I would remember to talk about it. But again, you're just running this with your conversion from the fire damage. You're actually doing impressive amounts of damage here with this. If you want to, you could go into Safeguard for a similar kind of fun time. Again, you'll notice ranged expertise here. Now, if you really want to, and I typically do this, but not always, run Bursting Round, because again, we're converting that fire damage over, we're converting that physical damage over. Both of these become acid. So Bursting Round actually becomes acid damage. So that's a fairly good time. Now, again, I'll usually run Word of Renewal. And then beyond that, where you want to go typically depends on what you want to do. I'll typically run Resilience here as well. Again, Word of Renewal, Resilience makes a lot of sense. Safeguard, right? That's a pretty good time. That's pretty magical. And then wherever else you want to take this, again, depends on you. Maybe you want to run Virus Might. Maybe you want to run Guardian of Empyrean with Celestial Presence with the conversion, right? Maybe you want to max that out. How many points off are we on this? Oh, there we go. Just get that poison and acid resistance down even further. You can do that. That's totally up to you. Actually, it probably would be slightly smarter to run Resilience at max, thinking about it. But it doesn't. Again, it does make a huge difference. Now, when I run the Devotions here, you'll notice a very strange combination here. Obviously, we're going into the Abomination for the poison damage. Vitality damage we have access to. Again, the Path of the 3 does convert a certain amount of, does do a certain amount of vitality damage. Not really that much, but this is doing some poison damage here. This particular part of it also does poison damage. This is just some bonus chaos and vitality damage if you really want it. You don't necessarily have to go all the way out here, but I typically do. More importantly, once you get the Abomination, Murmur is pretty useful. Again, we're reducing the enemy's poison and acid resistance here. We've got the Affliction, which does poison and vitality. Again, things that we're doing. So that's pretty nice. Beyond that, just kind of go gung-ho with the poison and acid over here. And I'll typically go into Eldritch Fire just for the chaos down. Yes, fire resistance goes down. We still technically do 10% fire damage usually between 20 and 0%. It depends on how lucky you are with your Perdition set. But that's just all a matter of it doesn't hurt to have the fire resistance down. We're already doing a bit of chaos damage out of the Abomination anyways, so that doesn't hurt. But overall, not my favorite way of playing this, honestly. The Poison Paladin, while fairly interesting to some extent, isn't as effective as a lot of other interesting builds, or even some of the baseline builds. Mostly because the constellations, as you probably just saw, aren't exactly ideal. There's no purely poison constellation for end game. This isn't purely poison. This is poison, vitality, and chaos. This, while it does have a certain amount of poison and acid as well, it's also got cold. This does cold poison. This does vitality poison. I mean, the only really specifically poison ones are the Manticore, and that's half for pets anyways. So that's not exactly something you necessarily want to go out of your way for. You can if you really want to, but it's a lot of points to invest in that for not quite as much reward as maybe I personally would like. Maybe you want to drop Cel's Witchblade for Manticore. That's totally up to you if you want to do that. But I just personally don't like the Manticore, but the only primary poison ones are the Rat and the Scorpion. And the rest of them usually splash in the Poison Acid with some other damage type. And with this build, while you have access to a little bit of Vitality, it's not very much, and it's not necessarily an amount you want to go out of your way to increase. So this particular build does have some issues with the constellations, just by how the constellations are. It's not really something you can change. So I don't really like playing this too often. Every once in a while, just for fun, I'll play this build, but there are better ways of playing a Poison Oathkeeper. It's just, I just want to throw that out there, that it is possible to play a Poison Paladin. This is probably my least favorite way to build Paladin, by the way. Again, primarily because the constellations really don't work quite as well with it as anyone would like, really. But I digress, that's just my personal opinion. If you really wanted to, by the way, you could probably go up to Chilling Rounds and splash that in if you really wanted to take advantage of the cold resistance that Murmur was doing. I have never done so personally, but if you want to, go for it. Now let's talk about the Vitality build, which focuses primarily on the Void Soul Bulwark. Now I want you to notice that right off the top, I highlighted the shield for this specific reason. 100% of that physical damage is being converted to chaos damage. Right, let's look at the rest of our conversions. I just want to point out the Flames of Ignifar bonuses as well. Chaos damage to Flames of Ignifar, right? And then we have the good old elemental damage converted to chaos damage, right? And then we have this, which converts 100% of the physical damage to chaos. 100% of the physical damage to acid damage for Aegis. Usually you're going to want to slap this on first, so that takes effect over this, if you need to. I'm pretty sure the shield takes priority, but you generally are going to want to run Crimson's Vile Scepter because, again, you have the vitality damage here. It's one of the few really potentially effective vitality weapons for Paladins. It enhances Aegis of Menhir, obviously, and the reason why we don't really have a problem with the acid damage is because you're going to go into Path of the Three anyways, which increases poison acid damage, right? That's just part of how it works. Oh wait, we're way overcapped on this. So, generally, that is why I'll usually run Crimson's Vile Scepter. Again, like most of these other builds that use a lot of Monster Infrequence, you can probably accidentally find something that might work better for you personally, or might be interesting to play with. I just prefer the Crimson's Vile Scepter. It really works well with what this particular build is doing. Now, also, I want to come down here and point out just all of what's going on. Notice that Flames of Ignifar is not converted. Also notice that the fire damage is converted to vitality damage to Aegis of Menhir. So even if, for some reason, Crimson's Vile Scepter's physical damage conversion is taking place first, the fire damage is being converted to vitality damage guaranteed, so it's not really that big of a deal. It's also really nice to have the poison acid damage splashed in, because with the vitality chaos focus, it's really tough to get rid of the chthonics, so the acid really kind of actually helps with that, so it really doesn't matter whether or not this is converting or not. If you're really a stickler for the chaos damage, just equip this second, because this should prioritize. Let me rephrase that. According to how I understand the prioritization, I'm not an expert on it, but this should prioritize first if you equip it first. But I also want you to point out that Flames of Ignifar is not being converted in any way, shape, or form. So you do actually need Tainted Flame. I just wanted to really make sure that you observed that, because despite all of the other conversions, all the conversions on this set affect affect Aegis of Menhir. Flames of Ignifar, while it does get bonus damage, specifically chaos and vitality damage, it isn't being converted in any stretch of the imagination. Also, peep the 30% minus 30% skill energy cost of Flames of Ignifar. You run all the way to Endless Flame, that's minus 25% skill energy cost as well. That is an absolutely massive decrease in how much energy this takes. Now, what you actually do with this is, Guardian of Empyrean, Vitality, Poison Acid Resistance down, Sign of Dreeg, obviously. Good old Aegis of Menhir for the delightful chaos damage. Yeah, I believe this is listing the priority physical damage converted to chaos damage first. I believe that's how that's working. I believe that is correct. If someone knows the order, if someone knows for a fact that the physical damage is being converted to acid damage is happening for priority reasons, let me know. But I am 98% confident that physical damage is being converted to chaos damage here. It takes priority. Pretty sure. Anyways, enough harping on that. You obviously want the Celestial Presence here for the reduction in resistances. That's pretty huge. Path of the Three, obviously. Aegis of Men here. The whole Flames of Ignifar. Now, the last 15, you can do a lot with. Some people might instinctively try to go for Righteous Fervor, and I did the first time I played this build. I've played it twice. Righteous Fervor had a problem where, first off, Crimson's Vow Scepter wasn't hugely useful with Righteous Fervor. Usually what I will actually pull here is I'll usually just go into Word of Renewal, leave it at that. My last 3 points go into Resilience, because Righteous Fervor really didn't hit that hard, and honestly, when they were at melee range, I preferred to use Flames of Ignifar because of how cheap it was anyways. When they're in melee range, when they're at melee range and you have a Flames of Ignifar that does oodles more extra damage and costs 55% less energy, you're going to be busting out Flames of Ignifar before you ever even think to use Righteous Fervor. So I don't use Righteous Fervor. I did try it, but it's not nearly as effective as Endless Flame, and I'd rather have the healing from Word of Renewal besides. It just is handier for you. So that's generally where I approach this, and I'll also usually throw in Bolvar's Pendant specifically to get even more resistance drops out of the Guardian of Empyrean. Now, the bleeding doesn't really matter. I'm more interested in the Vitality drop for Guardians of Empyrean. And again, you can farm this for a version that also enhances Flames of Ignifar if you really want to stick that out. That's totally up to you. But this is usually the pendant that'll go with, and again, the rest of the equipment here is generally up to you, and even the weapon is generally up to you. I just prefer Crimson's Vile Scepter because it does boost Aegis of Men here, which you want, and it does vitality damage, which you want, and the acid damage that it incorporates is very helpful for helping you deal with Chthonics. The final setup that I want to talk about is this. This isn't a set. This is something that I came up with by accident, just wandering through my equipment, and I've built this a variety of ways, alright? I want you to understand that. Now, this is technically a variation of an elemental build. This is basically this build here without the Aether. Long story short. Now, I'll usually... Actually, I'm going to be really honest. Every time I've played this build, I've run a Ravager's helmet of some kind. Just because it just increases all the damage. There's not really any other good helmets for Paladins that enhances elemental damage. There's some that increase fire damage specifically, but that's not necessarily what we're going for. I like the Dread Gaze because it increases everything pretty equally. Personal preference there. Same thing with the Conduit here. Now, there are 3 pieces of equipment that I always equip here. The weapon is variable, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I have the Alder's Inquisition here because it's usually what I'll go for, and I'll again explain that in a bit. But, of course, we have the Frost Dread Cuirass, which is just doing all this cold damage. We have Chilling Rounds, and we have Reprisal. We also have the incredibly interesting Frost Dread Presence, which is just... basically, it's like the Night Chill Aura from Nightblade, but without the resistance down. And it does more damage instead of decreasing their total speed. This is incredibly useful. Keep in mind, remember Chilling Rounds and Reprisal. Then we have the Rime Forged Mantle. This is cold and lightning very specifically. We have Infernal Purge, which you'll remember is a part of the Flames of Ignifar. And then we have Ice Spread here, right? Fire damage, by the way, is being converted to cold damage with this one, but not with this one. Worth noting. And then finally we have the Sky Breach Bulwark, which is converting physical damage to lightning damage. Also worth noting. We also have, I would also like to point out the changes to Aegis of Men here. Specifically, the fire damage is being converted to lightning damage, and the Chain Lightning Block skill, which is always a magical time. And then we've got Conduit of Whispers for just whatever. And I'll explain the Light Plates of Valor in a hot minute. Now, the reason why I typically go into Alder's Inquisition is because it increases Righteous Fervor. Now, you'll remember, we've got Reprisal here, right? We have Reprisal here. Sorry, that's not Reprisal. We've got Reprisal here. Now, Righteous Fervor, we increase. We have Retribution. Retribution is increased by something else. What was that? Yes, here, I'm sorry. The Rhymeforged Mantle. So, we've got enhancements to the Righteous Fervor. Right, we've got a pistol equipped, so we're shooting at range. We've got Aegis of Men here, which is doing lightning damage at this point. And then we've got Chilling Rounds, boosted from Frost Red Cuirass. And we've also got Infernal Purge increases from Rhymeforged, right? Now, here's how I typically play this. Let me put this all together. Opening move, throw an Aegis of Men here. Start blasting with Ranged Expertise, Chilling Rounds, and Righteous Fervor, doing a very odd combination of physical, lightning, and fire damage. Now, the lightning is coming from the physical damage being converted by the Sky Breach Bulwark. And the fire damage out of Righteous Fervor is being converted to cold damage. So you're actually doing a really interesting combination of, with just Righteous Fervor, you're doing physical and all three elements. Besides the fact that Alder's Inquisition itself does, if you'll notice, fire, cold, and lightning damage all elemental, and increases elemental, and converts physical damage to elemental damage. We're ignoring the artifact handling here because I really don't like the artifacts as a personal matter, but anyways, so we're doing elemental damage across the board with Righteous Fervor, we're enhancing that with Ranged Expertise, we're shooting faster with Ranged Expertise, and we have Chilling Rounds for the freeze possibility, and we're stunning enemies with Aegis of Men here. Now, you'll be surprised how effective this is at keeping enemies fairly far away from you, but even when they close the distance, you're blasting them with Flames of Ignifar, which is doing, once again, we're converting a certain amount of that fire damage to cold damage, we're doing fire damage, cold damage, lightning damage. This is elemental Flames of Ignifar. And when they get into melee range, oh look, you're blasting them with Aura of Censure, which, again, is being converted. Some of that fire is becoming cold damage. It's also reducing enemy elemental resistances. So in total, the reason why I use Alder's Inquisition is it really opens me up to a very fascinating, surprisingly effective method at keeping most enemies away by through a combination of the Aegis of Men here stun and the freeze from Chilling Rounds, eliminating the smaller guys, usually. And then when the big guys do get in melee range, you just blast their face off with Flames of Ignifar with Aura of Censure to assist in terms of resistance decreases. Right? That's generally how I run this. Okay? When I run Devotion, now you'll notice I don't have Devotion points here because I'm actually going to go back to this. Nope. Not this one. This one. The only real difference between the Devotion points of this setup here and, this class here, because they both do elemental damage, is instead of going for a Toxeru, who you'll notice increases elemental damage and aether damage, you instead are going for the Blind Sage, who purely increases elemental damage throughout. Right? That's really the only change. Instead of a Toxeru, you go for Blind Sage. There is a mild change you actually have to pull, because she requires more purple, she requires more green. It's a very minor change. You basically, all you really need to do is you swap out, well actually it really depends on how you want to go for this yourself, but you'll usually drop the Jackal and go for some combination of green and red to your heart's content, or if you really just feel like it, you could just, there's a couple of different ways you could do this. You could theoretically, it really depends. I would have to rework this pretty heavily. You would drop the Mantis, drop the Jackal, go for the Vulture, and then grab 2 extra green out of... Where would you grab the 2 extra green out of? You could do, theoretically, the Lotus, because that's only 4 points. You could do the Crow, too. Yeah, you've got a couple of different options here. But basically, instead of going for a Toxeru, you're going for the Blind Sage. That's really the only primary difference. How you get there is going to depend on your personal preferences, because it is elemental damage, and there's a lot of avenues for that. But that's generally... This is something I crafted, again, by accident, and it's a lot of fun to play. It's a lot more effective than you would think it would at first glance. Now, I mentioned some other options. If you really want to use melee, you can go into the Spectral Longsword. You do have to some extent, farm up for a Spectral Longsword that actually helps the Oathkeeper part as well. Usually you're looking for a Spectral Longsword that just randomly increases Aegis of Men here by 2 points or whatever. Or you could, instead, if you were not really looking to farm, you could go into the Cortosian Invoker, which just does elemental damage across the board. Word of Pain isn't something we really use here, neither necessarily as Clarity of Purpose, but you could go into Word of Pain if you really wanted to. If you're using the Cortosian Invoker, you're obviously not using... This isn't the one. If you're using the Cortosian Invoker, you're obviously not using Ranged Expertise or Chilling Rounds, so those are points you can put into Word of Pain if you want to. I just, again, prefer the Alder's Inquisition because it does elemental damage, it increases elemental damage, it increases Righteous Fervor, which itself becomes elemental because of the other equipment you've got kicking around, and you can use Chilling Rounds and Aegis of Men here to play a really excellent game of Keep Away and then blast their face in with Flames of Ignifar when they get into melee range. It's, like I said, it's surprisingly effective, and it's more effective than you would think it would be when you first look at it. And again, Fleas. This is probably, out of all of the builds I've talked about for Paladin, this is the most malleable. I mean, to some extent, you're practically required to run Frost Dread, Cuirass, Rhymeforged Mantle, and Skybreach Bulwark, but you're by no means necessarily forced into using the skills that they provide because they're not, it's not like they're part of a set or anything. So just go ahead and mix and match as you feel. This is basically how I accidentally came across this. But yeah, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. That is the 5 more interesting non-standard builds for Paladin. And if you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comments below. I must also very much ask you, these are just some of the cool builds that I've come up with that I found worked. These are not the only builds that I've ever tried. These are the ones that I enjoyed playing and were pretty effective overall, with the exception of the Poison Paladin, but I felt obligated to mention that because it is so weird compared to a lot of the other builds that I felt I needed to talk about it at the very least. I don't actually normally play Poison Paladin. Like I said, I've only played it a couple of times. I don't like it. I don't like Poison Paladin. Again, mostly it's mostly as a result of the constellations, the devotion points. I just don't like how they work with the Poison Paladin. But again, that's a matter of personal preference. Beyond that, these are some of my favorite non-standard builds. But if you have a cool non-standard build, please leave in the comments below. I would love to hear them. This particular episode is just kind of my wild fever dream builds that I've come up with in my crazier moments. But yeah, I would love to hear the cool builds that you've come up with. So yeah, leave those in the comments below. For Paladins, at least. let's keep on target with Paladins. Let's keep on subject. And yeah, otherwise, have a great 24 hours.